Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street partners with businesses, organisations, unions and social democratic parties across the globe to train leaders, develop engagement strategies and empower people to organise for change. In 2020, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to make a difference, inspire, give hope and enable leadership to achieve shared purpose. To find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, episode 48, I think. Your weekly centre-left political and cultural podcast that dives into the progressive issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And abroad, we are going, not that far though, just across the ditch to New Zealand. On today's podcast, we're going to be joined by Neil Jones, who was the former Chief of Staff to the then opposition leaders, Andrew Little, and then Jacinda Ardern into the election campaign that got Jacinda elected in 2017. And Neil coming on today to talk NZ politics and Jacinda and her leadership and how the Labor government over there has handled the outbreak of COVID-19 in such efficient and successful ways that now their economy has sort of reopened internally anyway. And we'll also get a bit of a breakdown as we lead into the election campaign, which is up in September this year. And we'll find out about how Jacinda and the team are going to get re-elected to form, hopefully, a new Labor government later this year. So look out for that episode today. Don't forget to subscribe to Socially Democratic on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or whatever podcast app you use. And if you use Apple Podcasts, please give us a rating and leave a review, a positive one. And for all the updates on the podcast, don't forget to follow the socials on Dunn Street for Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Let's get to today's episode. Oh, actually, no, wait. Today's episode was also produced by Rebecca Connell. Thank you, Rebecca, for your great work. Okay, we're taping this one on a Friday afternoon in sunny Melbourne in lockdown. Second podcast for the week. Just call me a working class man. On the line from Wellington, New Zealand, we are joined today by the former Chief of Staff to the then Leader of the Opposition, Andrew Little, and the following Leader of the Opposition into the election that took Labor back into government, Jacinda Ardern. He now heads up the Capital Government Relations team, and joining us online from NZ is Neil Jones. Welcome to Socially Democratic.
Hey, Stephen. Nice to talk to you again.
It's been a while, actually. Last time I did speak to you, you were the Chief of Staff to Andrew Little. And how things changed so quickly in that period from when I was over in New Zealand to then leading up into that election in which you then got back into government.
Yeah, it was the most bizarre 7 weeks of my life, I think, going from the public basically not liking us and being on about 23%, I think, on the last poll, to winning the election and forming a government and going through this wild campaign where suddenly we were cool, people liked us, and you saw young people wearing Labor T-shirts and volunteering in droves. It was amazing.
It really was, actually. I came back over on election day and flew into Auckland and went and door knocked, canvassed in South Auckland. And the response on the doors that day, I mean, albeit it was turnout, so we're trying to drive Labor voters to go and vote, but it was huge. The attitudes of voters towards Jacinda and to Labor was so positive and so encouraging and so hopeful as well about change. It was a great campaign.
And I think for me, there was a real lesson there, which is, being a politico, I always thought policy and message were so important, and they are. But I hadn't sort of, I think, appreciated how important leadership and optimism and energy and hope are until that campaign when Jacinda Ardern took over. And, we'd got the policy, we'd got the messaging, but people weren't listening. And it really took that hope and energy and drive to really propel people.
I don't know if I've ever shared this theory before on the podcast, but I just think now is the time to do that. And if I have done this before, to the listeners, I apologize for going over old thoughts. But I have formed a view over time that politics needs to be, a political party needs to be, in particular, the elected representatives of that political party in Parliament. Essentially, the team needs to be like INXS, the band, the Australian band INXS. And I only choose INXS. I don't know why I choose INXS. There are probably other bands that I could choose. That classic kind of band with charismatic front person. The gender in this instance is not important. INXS doesn't work without both the Farris brothers writing incredibly great music, but also Michael Hutchence up front singing that incredibly great music and leading with charisma on the stage back in the days when concerts were packed out with hundreds of thousands of people in the MCG kind of scenario, right? Or at Wembley. INXS doesn't work if you flip the roles. If you try and get the Farris brothers up front trying to sing those songs, the music is now crap. Or if you try and get Michael Hutchence to write music, it doesn't work. Like, stay in your lane. And politics is very much like that. You can write the best policy, but if you don't have someone up front that can communicate effectively that policy to the public, they're not going to listen. And I noticed that, and I don't say it as a slight against Andrew Little either, but nothing really changed, did it, for you guys in terms of policy settings between the leadership of Andrew Little and then transferring across to Jacinda? But all of a sudden, people started paying attention.
Exactly. I mean, look, Jacinda Ardern did bring in more of a focus, I think, on climate change and the environment, which hadn't been there as much. But by and large, it was the same policy platform, the same policies that were planned were rolled out, by and large. And one of the criticisms people came up with was they said, "Oh, you've got the exact same policies, you've just changed your leader. You know, what's the big deal? Why is everyone voting Labor? What wants to vote Labor?" And I think that kind of, again, misunderstood what was going on. And while I'm no expert in excess, that's slightly outside my lane. I think I think the thing to remember as well as this is, apart from the fact that people connect with authentic politicians and charismatic politicians, is I think in politics we think that we're electing a manifesto with a talking head to explain it, but we're not. We're electing people, and most of the things a government does, you could never actually predict before a campaign. And this kind of will go into what we're talking about, I think. But nobody knew when they were electing Jacinda Ardern that she would face a terrorist attack in Christchurch. A man walking into the mosque and shooting it up, and a nation reeling from that. No one knew that COVID-19 would come along, would have to shut the economy down. How and have this major public health crisis. But people could see and trust Jacinda Ardern and her values and the kind of leadership and care she embodied, and say, actually, you're the kind of person with the kind of values we want to run our country, and we trust you to make the right decisions. And that's so important in politics because, like I say, Labor didn't have a manifesto policy on those things.
Yeah, no, they didn't at all. And we'll talk more about Jacinda's leadership a bit later in the podcast and the journey that she's been on, because I find it quite interesting, and I really want to get your take on that. But before we do, I think it's worthwhile just kind of talking about the context that you guys are in right now, and certainly from our Victorian listeners. The state of Victoria, or Melbourne, metropolitan Melbourne, is now back in lockdown, whereas the rest of the state is not, and the rest of the country is slowly opening up. In New Zealand, the New Zealand government's response to the initial outbreak was regarded by many as being, first class or best practice. From the moment you identified your first case back in late February, walk us through the steps that the government took to address the spread of the virus in those weeks of early March.
I think one of the really important things that Jacinda Ardern did was she held a national sort of announcement, and everyone sort of stopped, and you walk down the street and people were on their phones, just like listening to the live stream in the middle of the street, huddled in doorways, and everyone assumed there was going to be some major announcement. And at the time, it seemed underwhelming. She simply announced a 4-step plan for how we would manage the virus, and it was from level 1, which is very few restrictions, up to level 4, which was a complete lockdown of the country. And she talked through those different steps and what would happen at each step, why we would go there, how we would get out of it. And it was a very clear explanation to New Zealand and a buy-in from New Zealand about how we were going to deal with the virus, and kind of got people psychologically prepared for what was coming. And so after that, a lot of the media coverage was, oh, that was underwhelming. It was just a comms presentation. What was the point of it? Shortly after, we went to level 2 immediately, level 3, level 4. And level 4 was the complete lockdown. And New Zealand, I mean, Jacinda Ardern was led the whole way through by a science approach. But it wasn't just science. I mean, these things are never just science. There's political judgments as well. Because you have to judge whether people are going to follow what you're doing. You have to judge whether it's feasible, and there are always costs and benefits. But she followed the science and took leadership, and she called a 4-week full lockdown of the country. And it was one of the strictest lockdowns.
Yeah,
in the
talk
world.
about that. What did that mean?
So it meant that basically you were confined to your house. You were confined to the people in your house. You could take one state-mandated walk per day out, or exercise per day. You go for a run or a bike ride, but you had to stay 2 meters apart. And you had to stay, the only reason you could drive your car was to a local supermarket to buy food. So I think supermarkets and pharmacies were open, but butchers, bakers, bars, everything else was shut. The only workplaces which could open were essential, basically those that were essential for the maintenance of life in New Zealand. So most businesses had to shut. And so it was one of the strictest lockdowns in the world, and it was quite remarkable that it happened in a Western democracy. I would not have thought it was possible before we entered that period. And I mean, at the time, there were doubters. There were people who said we should be more like Australia, where you can go to McDonald's or KFC or, be out and about more. The national opposition was screaming about, why aren't we following Australia? It's far more effective there. It's not as bad for the economy. There were even those who were saying we should be more like Sweden and just do nothing. So there was some opposition to it, but by and large, in fact, almost unanimously, the public backed it. The polls showed sort of 90% public support for the lockdown. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I think one of them was that we are not as polarized as some other countries. As a country, I think there's a lot more unity and community feeling in New Zealand than some other countries. For example, Britain or the US, where they've had, horrendous division over these things. But I think also Jacinda Ardern's leadership during it, she was decisive, but she was also calm and transparent and talked people through it honestly, and they trusted her. So when she said we have to do this, people trusted that it was the right thing to do. And they trusted she wasn't, when they had to implement some laws which were pretty draconian, essentially taking away huge civil liberties, they trusted her not to abuse those. And I think, she had these daily press conferences where every day she would stand there next to the Director General of Health, and the media could ask any questions they wanted. It was live streamed. In fact, it was broadcast to every New Zealander on television news. And every day she would explain what they were doing, what it meant, and how we were tracking. And it worked. We exited lockdown, and we had eliminated COVID-19 from New Zealand. Remarkably.
It really is remarkable when you think about it. And I think you're like, how many days now since you...
Oh, I forget.
Yeah, it's like
but it's a couple of months now, I think. Yeah.
Talk about the economic impact of doing such drastic measures. Like, what policy measures did the government implement to ensure that the economy was on some sort of life support in that phase?
Well,
I'm assuming you've locked down like major projects. Did they stop?
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
But what it meant was, I mean, this was the debate. So the debate was, is this going to be too damaging for the economy? But the argument always was that the best economic response is a good health response. And in fact, the Treasury did a range of scenarios which showed the best economic outcome for New Zealand was if the lockdown happened once, that was hard, and it worked. And the worst economic scenario was that the lockdown isn't strict enough, doesn't work, and we're in and out of lockdown restrictions for months and months and months. And that's what happened. So in terms of immediately, I mean, the government took a Keynesian approach. Grant Robertson, the finance minister, came out and said, he wasn't going to allow the crisis to be borne by the poor or for it to be an excuse for cuts. So there was a $51 billion package came through, which multiply that by about 5 or 6 for Australia for an equivalent.
Yep.
They put in a wage subsidy, which was very high trust, so no bureaucracy there. Businesses just applied and said, here are my workers and here's who I'm applying for, and it went straight into them. There was some controversy. Some said it should have been paid to the employees. The argument was you wanted to keep employees attached to the businesses and not be laid off, so it was easier to come out. The other thing was they trusted businesses to do it, but what they did was they published a list of businesses who had taken the wage subsidy, and they said they'd be auditing randomly as well, so that if you committed fraud, you'd probably be found out.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a roaring success. There was, unemployment has ticked up a little bit, but nowhere near what the projections said it might. They also did a bunch of things to help businesses around loans and support and so forth. And then there was a ban on kicking people out of rentals. So there's a rent freeze and a ban on evictions, and there's a mortgage holiday put in, because the other thing that the government realised was that the real misery in an economic downturn comes as well when people start being kicked out of their houses. When they're evicted, when people lose their homes that they own, that's when you start to get real displacement and misery. So the aim was keep people in their jobs, try and keep businesses running through that period, and try and keep people in their homes.
Is one of the problems that's happening in the United States now, particularly around the rental stuff, is that now that they're coming out of this rent freeze, people have to back pay what was frozen over that period, and they don't have the money to cover that. How have you guys managed to deal with that?
To be honest, that hasn't really emerged as an issue in public. I'm sure it is happening from place to place, but it's not something that's really come up as a major issue. I think, the unemployment impact hasn't been as bad as we thought it would be. So to be honest with you, I haven't heard that being a major issue in New Zealand any more than it normally is.
What's the steps now for the government as they come out of this heavy lockdown phase economically? What are the steps that the government are taking to start to bring the economy back to life?
One of the major things they're doing is investing in infrastructure, and particularly around shovel-ready projects. So one of the things they realised is that construction might just freeze up, and you need a bunch of jobs that people can go into. So they did a call for projects, and they've pumped billions into getting construction, both of transport and buildings, just getting that moving. For most of the economy, it's kind of just gone back to normal. The big issue that they face now is tourism and international education. Those are the two industries that are really struggling. And the reason why is because the rest of the economy is back to normal, and we're trading with our export partners as always. The issue is with the ban on anyone entering New Zealand who's not a New Zealand citizen or resident, and the 14-day quarantine. International tourism obviously has stopped. It's a reasonable chunk of the economy, and obviously foreign students, which has been increasingly what our education sector relied on to stay afloat. So those are two issues that are ongoing. I'm not sure the government's quite cracked how to deal with that yet. There aren't any easy answers. If people can't enter the country, they can't enter the country. But that'll be the challenge in the months to come.
I'm interested to get a sense of how the opposition, the National Party, have positioned themselves during this crisis. Good leadership by incumbents should benefit from emergencies and crises such as this, and we're seeing that mostly around the Western world. There's a few examples that stand out that don't do that, Donald Trump being one of them. Even Scott Morrison, who had completely ballsed up the response to the bushfires in early 2020, has been perceived as being a reasonably good leader over this period, and has worked in collaboration with state premiers. The National Party, how have they gone in this phase?
They totally bottled it, is the short answer. Look, as you say, if you're a leader in a crisis and you're competent, you do well out of it. There's a rally around the flag effect, and people reward you for that. And likewise, if you stuff up a crisis, you pay the price. Jacinda Ardern has, by all accounts, done an extremely good job, and so the opposition was always going to find it hard. The problem they had was they went from, there's this fine line an opposition has to run in a crisis where they need to hold the government to account. That's an important thing in a democracy, particularly when the government takes extraordinary powers, as ours did during the lockdown. But you've got to be careful you don't look like you're undermining the national response to the crisis. And Nationals had 3 leaders during this crisis, but the first one, Simon Bridges, just completely got offside with the public. He carped, he screamed, he was negative, and people just looked at him and they said, actually, he's not trying to hold the government to account in the national interest. He's actually just trying to undermine them and be negative. And he got offside with the public. He had one Facebook post he did where he just completely ragged on the government, and he had 20,000 responses just eviscerating him from the public. It was just horrendous. I mean, even I felt sorry for him, and and basically he'd never been a popular leader. I mean, the party had polled quite well under his leadership, but he had never been popular. He was sort of down the, in single digits in the preferred prime minister stakes, and that just really was the nail in the coffin. Then the next guy came along, Todd Muller, and he promised. I mean, his best speech he gave was the first speech he gave, where he said, New Zealanders don't want to hear opposition for opposition's sake. They don't want to hear us just carping and being negative. We think the government did a good job on the health response. Now let's focus on the economy and the economic recovery, which for the National Party was a very good message. He immediately then failed to provide an economic response, and then carped about the health response. And he at one point claimed that there was community transmission in New Zealand and the government was covering it up, just completely baselessly. His health spokesperson invented a story about a homeless man sneaking into a quarantine facility, which the Ministry of Health expended huge resource to investigate and found it was false. And then he was finally done when one of his MPs leaked confidential patient information about COVID-19 patients, which had been leaked by the former National Party president. And then the opposition went out attacking the government for incompetence for this leak, which they'd done themselves. And then it turned out his health spokesperson had also received a leak of similar information, and then had not told anyone about it, while the leader had been denying that he had anything to do with it. So, and that was what led to his resignation. So they stuffed that up completely. They're on to their third leader now during COVID, and she's been a little bit more cautious on this stuff. So we'll wait and see there. But I think it's fair to say they haven't covered themselves in glory over this period.
It's remarkable when you think about that, because they were the hallmark of stability when they were in government from a leadership standpoint, and now watching them in opposition, which happens to everyone. Like Labor in Australia has done the same thing over time, and so has the Tories. But it's just.
But I mean, John Key was, when he was National Party leader and Prime Minister, he was, I think, the most successful politician in the Western world in terms of. Didn't agree with his politics, but in terms of his political management, he ran an extremely tight, disciplined, stable operation, and they had this vice-like grip over the New Zealand public opinion, and they've just completely fallen apart with his departure, and then his successor Bill English's departure. And it's almost like they've reversed places. I mean, you'll remember when the Labour Party was in opposition in New Zealand and went through those troubles, and there's really echoes of that. When I see the National Party now, I remember those really just dreadful years in Labour.
It's like trading places.
Exactly, and exactly now Jacinda Ardern is in that position of that John Key was in, of being the leader of New Zealand who people respect, overseeing a stable party that's seen as doing a good job. So, yeah.
Red Sox fans will identify with that, because for 86 years, the Red Sox fans were basically living in the shadows of the New York Yankees. And then in 2004, they broke a curse, and then they've gone on to win 4 World Series, and the Yankees have, I think, only won 1 and didn't even make a World Series in the last decade. And we look back at the Yankees fans now who are all miserable, and we go, that used to be us. I remember those days. That used to be us. Your life sucks. And it's the same for you guys. I think it's fantastic to actually watch now, just seeing the National Party just completely fall apart constantly in the face of a great, stable, social, democratic political party.
Yep. And I have to say, it is also a reminder to all of us on the left not to ever get arrogant or complacent, because just as right now it seems great, and it seems like Jacinda and Labor is top of the game, and the National Party are a mess, and isn't this great? How easily it flips.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, it hasn't been plain sailing for the government, and in particular in recent days, there's been a number of resignations on both sides of the chamber, but in particular, just this week, Jacinda had to fire her immigration minister, Ian Lees-Galloway, after being tipped off by the opposition leader, which was quite bizarre, that he had engaged in a 12-month affair with a staffer in his office. I have read this through the media, but the subtext of it was implied that it was an abuse of power by the minister, therefore he had to resign. Is he resigning just because he's done a Gary Hart and has been caught being sleeping around, or is there more to this? What's going on here?
I think the context here is really important. So the National Party, following that the issue I discussed with the COVID patient leak, which led to a resignation and then the leader resigning, they then lost their former deputy and then number 3 to resignations. Then this Andrew Falloon thing came along. So there's National MP Andrew Falloon. He's an up-and-coming MP. He's only about 37 years old. He was a first-term MP, former senior advisor in the National Party when they were in government, and he had a very safe seat in the South Island. And he sent out this strange press release beginning of this week saying that he was resigning for mental health reasons. And Judith Collins, the new leader, put out a statement saying he's resigning for mental health reasons. We should respect his privacy. And everyone was very respectful of that. And Andrew Falloon was praised for having been open about his struggle. And everyone was very respectful. Until a few hours later, it started to emerge that Andrew Falloon was actually resigning because he had sent an explicit pornographic image to a teenage girl. And the police had investigated him, decided not to lay charges, but the parents of this 19-year-old woman had written a letter to the Prime Minister complaining about this. The Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, had then passed that to the Leader of the Opposition. They'd asked for consent of the person involved, passed it to the Leader of the Opposition, who had then tried to cover it up under mental health claims. Over the next couple of days, it emerged that multiple young women had received pornographic, unsolicited messages from this MP. He's obviously resigned from Parliament. Police are investigating him. So that was the backdrop. They were really in crisis.
Yeah. And
I think what happened then was just there have been rumours apparently about Ian Lees-Galloway in this affair for some time. And Judith Collins, I think, decided to try and play a bit of revenge on it. That's not to excuse everything Ian's done, but I think the Leader of the Opposition saw an opportunity to change the story and make it a plague on both their houses, and so sent the PM a note saying, "I'm aware of this thing your minister's done." And then she tipped off the media that morning that she'd done that, and the story broke that it was Ian Lees-Galloway, and Jacinda Ardern sacked him. So I think it probably would. It may not have been such an issue were it not for the environment that it was in. That Judith Collins wanted to make Jacinda Ardern look like she wasn't acting on her minister behaving inappropriately, and the way she even tipped off the PM, just as the PM had tipped off her, it was kind of a sense to try and mirror it. I think the things that, if it was just an affair, I think it would have been difficult to justify sacking him without sacking probably half the MPs in Parliament.
Right.
I think there's been this mutually assured destruction for a long time in New Zealand, as I'm sure there are in other places, that if you start this kind of witch hunt, you'll have MPs on every side falling down, and the press gallery who report on it are equally compromised. So, and there's a broader thing, which is that these moral issues are not issues for the public interest. These are issues between the MP and their families, and that's a private issue. Where I think Jacinda Ardern pointed out with Ian Galloway there was an issue was the fact it was a staffer and he was Minister for Workplace Relations meant that there was an argument that was inappropriate, and it was doubly inappropriate given his portfolio. The other issue she raised was it left him open to allegations he had misused the power of his office, and that is being investigated whether there were any resources used incorrectly. There's no sense at this stage that there were. So I think it was a mix of, I think it was a borderline case probably, but one that was, the issue was heightened because of the political issues around it.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's interesting because when I first read it as a standalone issue, I sort of thought, wow, that's moving into new territory now if we're going to start dumping ministers because of how they conduct themselves in their private life between two consenting adults, as opposed to your man Andrew Falloon, who sounds like a bit of a dirtbag.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is actually an important thing, though, which is that one of the unfortunate things about this story is it has become a story about MPs misbehaving. And I think what has been missed is Ian Galloway, you can criticise his actions, but at the end of the day, he was in a consensual relationship with someone. And the rules he broke, he hasn't. It doesn't appear he's done anything grossly inappropriate beyond his own private issues. Andrew Falloon has it looks like potentially committed a criminal action,
right?
And the issue here is consent. He has harassed a series of young women with explicit pornographic images they did not want to receive, which I think is a different scale entirely. But it's all been lumped into aren't our MPs terrible and misbehaving?
Yeah. Just a segue question into the media in New Zealand. I could never really get a handle on when I've been over in NZ and read your papers and watched your television. I can't sort of get a sense of the editorial tone of the media in New Zealand. In Australia, we've got the News Limited press that tend to take a fairly conservative position, and then we have sort of Fairfax that tend to be a little bit more left-leaning, although they're sort of self-loathing lefties, so they don't like Labor doing well, and they sort of tend to sort of talk up the Greens more than anything. They've been very critical of Daniel Andrews here in Victoria. Daniel can't seem to do anything right in their eyes. Meanwhile, we're getting belted by News Limited at the same time, so it's kind of like clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right. Here I am stuck in the middle with you. But the press in New Zealand, for the Australians listening, how would you give it a summary of the media and how they position themselves politically in NZ?
I think if you asked any journalist in New Zealand, they would say they're objective and neutral. And
any journalist says that, right?
Well, true. I mean,
sure you are.
Is fair and balanced. I'll be careful here. Look, I think frequently journalists in New Zealand are accused of being left wing or right wing. I don't think there is an explicit partisan bias in most New Zealand media. I think most editors tend to, or editorial, decision makers are probably lean rightwards and probably are more conservative and more national focused. But I think most, say, press gallery journalists are not interested in partisan politics. They're very focused on the game. So it's all about sensation and the game. And there are narratives which are very entrenched. So, Labor isn't good for the economy. Labor can't get its numbers right. That's one that's deeply entrenched. So there will be stories about Labor getting things wrong, or Labor's not competent. These are kind of narratives that will run, that they will cling to. I don't think, though, they really are particularly left or right wing. There are some. I mean, for example, there's a few shock jock type radio hosts. There's people like Mike Hosking who run the largest commercial radio station, News Talk ZB's breakfast show. He's just an out and out national partisan. There's a bit of that going on, but I don't think there's any great conspiracy against the left, and I don't think we have that same kind of Murdoch style News Limited sort of thing you have in Australia.
When you were the chief of staff to the opposition leaders, strategically, how did you approach the media from a comm standpoint when you were trying to get your your key messages out, who did you go to? Was it TV? Was it radio? Was it print? Was it digital?
It just depends on the sort of story. I think. I mean, the TV is still where it's at. You know, if you've got a major story, the TV is where the eyeballs are, and that's where you're going to get the cut through. But there are other stories you get out through digital and print that are more complicated, perhaps, or there might be a journalist who's more sympathetic to your issue. I think it wasn't really a matter of which channel you use. The major thing to be aware of was what are the narratives at play about your party, and how do you be careful around that. So we knew that the major narratives we faced were we were divided, we couldn't manage the economy, and we were incompetent. And so everything we did, we had to make sure that we had costed everything down to the last cent. We'd had it approved by an independent economist. We shut down any chance that someone would speak differently on the issue, because that would be magnified. We made sure we'd got the Greens on side, because if we didn't, they might speak out and it becomes a Labor fights the Greens. How can they possibly govern issue? Yeah. So we made sure we were aware of where we were vulnerable and where the media would try to hit us or find an angle that fit with a narrative, and we would try to cover against that.
It's such a trope about social democratic parties that we can't manage the economy. It's just remarkable. Meanwhile, the level of effort and energy that Labor governments and oppositions have to go to prove their economic credentials. Meanwhile, we've got the Tories on the other side. It's like the last days of Rome, the way that they're behaving.
I'll give you an example. In 2017, in July, the Labor Party in opposition had put out a entire costed alternative budget. Every single line there, based on Treasury figures, independently audited by an economic consultancy. And that was what we had to do to try and start to dampen down the voices saying Labor can't afford its policies, Labor can't be trusted with the economy. This time in the cycle, July 2020, the National Opposition has no policy published, really, a few roads that don't add up. They have no fiscal plan. And in fact, one enterprising journalist, Thomas Coughlan, did a story last night, first I've seen of this, where he found that they have promised to cut $80 billion of debt over 10 years with no new taxes, which would require the biggest cuts in health, education and welfare this country's ever seen. And so either they've got this great right-wing agenda, or more, which no one knows about, or more likely, they've just made a bunch of promises that don't add up, which are utterly hopeless, and they're completely unfit to run the economy. But you don't really hear that story, because they're the National Party, so people kind of accept that, they probably know what they're doing.
Yeah. Something that we're going to have to overcome eventually, and we do from time to time.
I think one thing I would say, though, is Labor. I mean, Labor is actually more trusted now on the economy by the public than National in New Zealand, which has not been the case for more than a decade, probably longer, probably 15, 20 years, if we're honest. And part of that is Grant Robertson has just had to run, the finance minister has had to run a conspicuously conservative fiscal policy, and almost ostentatiously conservative, to the point where economic commentators were demanding he spend more money and borrow more. And he kind of reluctantly relented. And then there's this remarkable, this hilarious thing where these economic commentators are congratulating themselves for pressuring Grant Robertson to actually spend money, which of course he always wanted to do, but he had to be very careful, because when COVID hit, if he hadn't done that, he'd be slammed. Whereas he could say, we've been careful with the money, we've paid back debt, we've got it low, and now we're going to borrow for the rainy day. And everyone kind of pats him on the back. But he has run it very well, and Labor is now trusted, which means Labor can borrow, Labor can spend, and doesn't have the same kind of public distrust, which frankly was so toxic they wouldn't vote for us in opposition, because they thought we'd just spend all the money and ruin the economy. It was, that's how strong it was.
Yeah. Props to Grant Robertson. Love Grant. And great to hear he's doing a good job in the position of Finance Minister. Let's turn to the election, which is not that far away. September 11? 20th, sorry. I'm going to
19th, 20th.
Oh no! Don't tell me you don't know. That's terrible. I was hoping you. It's in September. Okay, it's in September.
You've rocked my confidence.
Yeah. One wonders why I didn't write that down. It's not that far away. It's in September. Now, just
It's the 19th actually, Stephen.
oh, very good. I think you do.
I just googled it.
Nice one. I'm glad you got that machine. Let's give the Australians a sense of where Labor is right now in terms of they're obviously in a coalition government. I'll let you explain all of that and just talk a little bit about the electoral system in New Zealand.
Sure. So we have a mixed member proportional system, an MMP system that's based on the German model. And basically, it's proportional. So parties don't usually win a majority. The amount of votes you get means the percentage of votes you get is the percentage of seats you get in the House. So no party since we adopted MMP in 1996 has ever had a majority. They've always relied on coalitions. So where Labor is, in the 2017 election, Labor won 37% and formed a coalition with both the Greens and New Zealand First, the Greens being a nicer version of your Green Party, and New Zealand First being a sort of conservative populist party. Hard to explain New Zealand First to anyone who's not from New Zealand. They're not as racist as Pauline Hanson. They kind of want to return New Zealand to about where it was in sort of 1978, kind of the pre-neoliberal National Party, if that makes sense.
I like the specifics of actually picking the date 1978. I think that's great. I respect that greatly. Their leader, Winston Peters, who I regard as the guy that would survive a nuclear blast and still be in Parliament, he's a survivor.
Well, he is, though this might be the nuclear blast this time. They're polling about 2% in the latest poll.
Ooh, interesting.
But look, before COVID, it was pretty even. It was pretty evenly cut. National was polling in the mid-40s. And together with the minor ACT party, they could potentially form a government. And Labor and the Greens were sort of neck and neck with them, with New Zealand First looking to be out. COVID has definitely swung that. And there's a range of polls that have come out. But broadly speaking, Labor's, they peaked about 59%, which is just unheard of. But currently, Labor's around 50-ish and National's around 30-ish polls. You add the Greens on, they'll get sort of 5, 6, 7%. That's currently, we look like we're getting to a historic, possibly Labor majority, though I think that's still unlikely, or a straight Labor Green government, which would be of a far more progressive flavour than the Labor Green New Zealand First government. Where I would, I think, add a note of caution is that National does have a new leader. The campaign will obviously shake things up a bit. And also, a lot of the voters currently with Labor are not natural Labor voters. National has typically had around 40% as their base support for about the last 17 years since they consolidated the centre-right. And I think, you talk to Labor's polling people and they'll say our at-risk voters used to be kind of mechanics and nurses and teachers. And now our at-risk voters are lawyers and accountants and consultants. So there's a lot of people who I think are probably centre-right voters who naturally gravitate to National, who have shifted to Labor over the COVID-19 crisis, and I think will not be parked there for a long period of time.
What do you mean by at-risk voter? That's a term I've not heard before.
Sorry, people who are currently saying they'll vote for you, but who may leave. So they might be, say, someone who is typically voted National, is currently voting Labor, but is saying, actually, I'm thinking of switching. And when you're looking at your polling, you're thinking, who are the people we might lose, and how do we keep those people?
Right. Okay. How has the coalition of Labor, the Greens Party, and New Zealand First gone? When Jacinda and the team entered into government with this coalition, I was like, wow, this is going to be interesting. Has it been a success? Where has there been successes and where's the challenges existed?
Look, I think by and large, it's been more successful than people would have thought. When the government first came together, it was the first government under MMP where there's been 3 proper parties in a coalition. Normally, it's been a 2-party coalition or one major party with some little tiny ones. And people predicted it would blow up in 6 months. They said, look, New Zealand First and the Greens hate each other. Labor's not going to be able to manage this unwieldy coalition. And by and large, it's managed. It started to fray a bit more recently, particularly around the environment, where the Greens want to make some gains. So does Labour, and New Zealand First has been blocking things. I think, though, look, they've managed to pass the Zero Carbon Act, for example, which means that New Zealand's going to be net zero emissions by 2050. They've built thousands of state houses after a decade of decline. They've done a huge family incomes package, which has reduced child poverty. There are a whole lot of areas where they have made great progress. I think, though, everyone would agree that it would be very much simpler and far more effective if there was a straight Labour-Green coalition after the election.
The audience will be interested in the relationship between Labor and Greens. I think some of the people that would listen to this podcast would be of the view of in that camp of why can't we all just get on? And then there'll be others who have dealt with the Greens in hand-to-hand combat in the trenches of inner city Melbourne who would have a view that I can't even share on this podcast because it would be so verbally aggressive. But they one of the challenges that we face certainly here in Victoria, and it's starting to happen across the other states as well, is this purity of Greens politics, and it's purity because you're never going to get a chance to govern anyway. So we can set this principled position, and we all know that in politics and in government, it's about compromise. It's all the grey areas and working through, trying to get outcomes that help as many people as you possibly can, but you're not going to help everyone. How have the Greens gone in government in New Zealand? Are they a different beast to the Greens over here, or have they had to deal with compromise?
Yeah, look, I'll start with the Greens and the differences. I think the Greens here are different and our relationship is different for the reason that our electoral system is different. So yours sets you up for conflict. Similarly, I've done some campaigning for Labour when I was in the UK, and it's hand-to-hand combat there because it's a direct zero-sum game. Here in New Zealand, because of our electoral system, Labour needs coalition partners. So if people vote for the Greens and they get over 5%, it means we have a coalition partner. Labour's worried this election that the Greens might drop out. That's a worst-case scenario for Labour. So it means that we have a far more cooperative relationship, and it means that we recognise we have to govern with them. In terms of how the Greens have gone in government, look, I think any Green Party is torn by the fact that they are created by activists who often want to completely overturn our social order, but also an economic order, but also they're operating within a system where they have to govern, where they have to operate in Parliament and get gains through compromise. And so you end up with two wings in most Green parties between, in Germany they call it I think it's the Relos and the Fundies, where you have, and we have this in New Zealand, we have one wing of the Greens who want to work through the processes to make solid gains over time. And you have others who just say, we should burn the whole government down because they haven't introduced full eco-socialism by next Wednesday. And that is always the tension. They've managed it pretty well here in New Zealand. They have a co-leadership system where they can manage that tension. They can have one who is constructive and practical and one who is far more radical. But they have struggled with the need to compromise. There are, a lot of Green members are furious at their own party because, having won 7% of the vote, they haven't got the entire Green Party manifesto installed. And so that is a tension they face. But look, by and large, I think they've done reasonably well in government, and they should be returned.
Just when you were talking about then, all I had was images of Dennis the peasant in Monty Python's Holy Grail, where he's arguing with his wife about "you're fooling yourself. We're living in a dictatorship." Anyway, what are going into this election campaign? Is this going to be a COVID election campaign, or are any of the traditional bread and butter issues going to break through, and the parties or Labor will have a chance to campaign on that? This is weird, right?
Yeah, look, it's hard to say, to be honest with you, but my suspicion at this point is that it will be a COVID election. It will be about who's best to continue to manage the health response, which at the moment is the borders, and who is best to manage the economic recovery. And I think National would like it to be about anything other than COVID. They would like it to be about whether the government has delivered on all its social programs. There are some programs the government hasn't delivered on. The Kiwi Build program, which to build 100,000 houses in 10 years, has been a spectacular failure. The promise to build light rail down Dominion Road, which was Jacinda Ardern's first promise, nothing's happened. So there are issues on delivery which National would like to have made this election about, but I think they're going to be unable to, because frankly it just doesn't resonate with the public. Because Kiwi Build feels like about 10 years ago after COVID. The argument the government can't deliver, well, they've just delivered saving New Zealand from being infected with COVID and keeping the economy running. So that those criticisms don't really work. So I think it's going to be a strangely, in a sense, apolitical election, if that makes sense.
What happens if the virus breaks out again in early September?
Labor may be cooked.
Yeah, right.
I think one of the risks Labor faces is that in some ways it's a victim of its own success. No border is hermetically sealed. It is inevitable. The experts say it is inevitable that it will break out into the community at some point. There are still cases arriving in New Zealand from overseas. We're isolating them, but as you've seen in Australia, it can get out. And if it does get out, my worry is that the bar of expectation from the public is so high that will be seen as a failure, even though it is almost impossible to prevent. The government is, Labor and government is trying to prepare the public for that. Say, look, it may get out. Here's what we're doing to prepare for that. So look, we'll see. I mean, there is huge trust in Jacinda Ardern. There is huge trust in Grant Robertson in terms of his management of the economy. So maybe we'll get through it. But I think that is the single biggest risk Labor faces.
Yeah, you'd be shitting yourself about that. I thought about that last night.
And the thing is, that it is grossly unfair, because even if we did have an outbreak, which we then contained, it would still be seen by many as a failure, I think. Whereas you compare that to any other country, it would be a roaring success.
Yeah, I mean, that's the weird thing, though. The debate we're having in Australia, and in particular the debate we're having down here in Victoria about this second wave of outbreaks, one can make an argument this is actually still the first wave, and we just didn't actually have an outbreak in the first wave when we had the lockdown. And you compare that to what's going on in the United States and what was going on in Europe and what's happening in South America. And I was on a phone hookup last night with some people from the US and from parts of Europe, and they asked me about what's coronavirus been, or what's COVID been like in Australia, and I sort of threw some numbers at them, and they laughed at, and I said, "Oh, this is really contentious. People are pulling their hair out, and this is Armageddon and doom and stuff." And they're looking at us going, "You're kidding yourself? Really? That's a problem?"
Yeah, and I think that's why perspective is important. I mean, look, we had some issues here in New Zealand with the managed isolation we're doing in the hotels where people arrive, and we had a few escapees, people who just broke out windows, down fire escapes, scaled fences, escaped, got chased down and caught. And you would have thought that Jacinda Ardern had personally infected New Zealand with COVID, even though it didn't break out into the community. They were caught, they were sent back. Yeah. And I mean, fair enough. There's going to be media scrutiny, but the level of anger and outrage there was, you would have thought that the government had absolutely failed New Zealand, as opposed to done a really good job and had a few teething issues.
Yeah. Yeah, perception and perspective is such a critical thing in this. And also, what I worry about going forward, and we've had a bit of experience of this in Victoria, the fact that we've had to go back into lockdown in metropolitan Melbourne. I mentally think that the electorate thought that we'll have to go through this really, 2020 has been a weird year. Okay, sure, we're going to go into the lockdown, but it's only going to last a certain amount of time, and we're going to come out of it and life will resume again. And I can't predict the future, but I hate to say it, but I feel like we're going to have to consider that this could be, wearing the mandatory requirement to wear face masks, the social distancing, the restrictions put in place, the impact that's going to have on the economy. This could be the new norm for not just the next 12 months, but for the next 2, 3, 4 years. We could still be wearing masks in 4 or 5 years. I mean, I don't know. I mean, obviously, if we get a vaccine, then the ball game changes a bit, but I don't know how
Yeah, I
you, as a
mean,
political leader, say to a community, "Hey guys, don't prepare for the next 6 months. Please prepare for the next 6 years."
yeah, and look, I mean, we are lucky enough, as I say, because we've eliminated it, we don't have any of those restrictions in New Zealand. So we live our lives entirely as it was pre-COVID. Um, but it does raise economic issues then. I mean, even assuming we can keep it out of New Zealand, you know, what do we do with the tourism industry?
Mm.
You know, do we just say, sorry, we can't support you for another 2, 3 years, you just have to close? It's a it's You start to have serious questions about reshaping your economy and your society.
Yeah, and I think that there is some opportunity there, particularly for social democratic governments around the world to hate such a cliche sentence, but to reframe that narrative, but actually kind of come up with we remember in the 90s we were all obsessed about the third way. We need to create. I think here's an
Mm.
opportunity. This crisis and this urgency presents an opportunity for social democratic governments and social democratic parties to sit down and say, right, how can we restructure our society? Because
Mm.
really, what's happening in Australia and the federal Liberal government is they are having to adopt traditionally left wing positions economically. Government is now
Yeah,
relevant. Government's now
yeah,
important to people.
and I think one of the issues that really came up during COVID was the inadequacy of our welfare safety net, for example. That, you know, when you have people who are, and thankfully we didn't, that this hasn't happened to the extent we thought it would because the economy has done better, but we have this prospect of people losing their jobs, and our housing market has got so out of control that the amount you get in a welfare benefit doesn't even cover rent in major cities. People simply wouldn't be able to survive, and so the government put in a short-term kind of premium benefit for people who are laid off due to COVID. But there is this issue about how do we support people moving in and out of work? How do we support people in an era where the housing market is so out of whack? I think there's huge issues there. I mean, similarly, we had issues around sick leave. People who were getting who had COVID symptoms saying don't come to work, and they're saying, well, I can't afford not to come to work, so I only have 5 days sick leave. So yeah, I think there's all kinds of opportunities. I think for social democrats to start looking at some of these issues and saying we've actually got to do better.
Yeah. Well, I wish you guys the best of luck. Before we wrap up, just sort of final thoughts as you're heading into the election campaign. What's some things that we should be looking out for if we want to pay attention to the campaign? Seats or parts of the campaign, the movement of the campaign, the colour. What's Labor's strengths going into this campaign from an electoral sense? I just want to just before you gather your thoughts on that, for the viewers out there listening to this podcast and having worked in my old job with the Labor Party in New Zealand, I've always been in great admiration and respect for the campaign capabilities of the New Zealand Party, right across the board. It's a great outfit. It's a sharp operation, and a real forward-looking attitude towards trialing new ways of campaigning and testing stuff. There's an entrepreneurial aspect to the way that you guys campaign that's really, really impressive and punch well above your weight. And there's always been a good relationship between campaigners here in Australia and in New Zealand across the Tasman. So it's
And I should note, Stephen, I'll stroke your ego here, but I do mean it. You've been an integral part of particularly our field operations in New Zealand, actually getting us to where we are now. So I want to recognise that. But look, I mean, New Zealand Labour Party's nearly doubled its field team compared to 2017. They're building very much on that last campaign. The digital has really stepped up. So digital online fundraising has gone from being a sort of something that adds a bit to your fundraising to being a major donation stream, which is huge. And I think as well, the Labour Party never really stopped campaigning. So, about 18 months ago, the campaign group set up again and has been building ever since then. So I think that sort of permanent eye on the campaign and building that infrastructure has been, that's been what Labor's been doing, and I think it'll go well. It's a really well organised campaign. Hayden Munro, our campaign manager, is outstanding talent.
Yes.
Hayden, and Megan was the campaign chair again, very capable minister who's overseeing that. In terms of what we're looking at, look, the seats themselves don't really matter that much in our system. It's about your party vote, and I think the key thing will be whether New Zealand First gets in will be really important in terms of the future shape of the government. And I think whether the Greens get in, I think if there is a risk, National's only path to victory is if both the Greens and New Zealand First drop under 5%, drop out of Parliament and they can somehow squeeze ahead of Labor. I think that's unlikely, but that'll be the interesting thing, those two minor parties.
Well, we look forward to seeing this campaign unfold as we get closer and closer to the date in September, which I've now forgotten again. It's the 19th, isn't it?
It's the 19th. Yeah. I think it was 20th last time, but I might be confused.
Yeah, but best of luck to all of the team over there in New Zealand with the campaign coming up. Thanks very much, Neil, for taking time out of your busy schedule to come on and talk to us about a whole number of things that's going on across the ditch. We wish you the best of luck in your endeavours, and we'd love to have you back on the show at some time to give us an update about how things are progressing.
Thanks, mate. Good talking to you again.